Get ready to experience a story that will touch your heart. A story of resilience, kindness, and how small actions can transform lives in extraordinary ways. In Beyond Appearances, you'll meet Henry, a homeless man, and the Walkers, a family in need. What happens when two very different lives intersect? Find out how one act of generosity can change not just a day but an entire destiny. Don't miss this heartwarming journey that will inspire you to look beyond appearances. Click now and watch the video. The lights in the house were on, but the atmosphere was steeped in shadows. James Walker, seated at the kitchen table, stared at the paper in front of him with a furrowed brow. It was an overdue utility bill, 2 weeks past its due date. Beside it sat a growing pile of papers, more bills, late payment notices, and a menacing eviction warning. He pressed his temples with his hands, trying to find a solution that seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. Emma, his wife, crossed the room in silence. She carried a stack of clothes she needed to deliver to her clients the next day. A seamstress out of necessity, she accepted any orders that could bring in a few dollars. As she passed James, she avoided eye contact. She didn't want him to see the weariness in her face, and she herself wasn't ready to face the weight of worry she knew was etched in his. In the living room, their 2 children, Oliver and Lily, sat on the floor with their school books spread out. Oliver, 11, was trying to help 8-year-old Lily with her homework. But even there, where voices were usually full of laughter and play, the tension was palpable. Every now and then, Lily would glance out the window, observing the streetlights, which seemed steadier than the energy within their own home. James let out a deep sigh, a sound almost inaudible but heavy with frustration. He had been unemployed for months, ever since the local market where he worked as a manager shut down due to bankruptcy. Since then, his attempts to find new work had been in vain. He had grown used to rejection, but what hurt the most was the feeling that he was failing as a provider for his family. Emma finally broke the silence, placing a small plate of plain pasta in front of James. It was all they had left for dinner. "Are you going to eat?" she asked, her tone more practical than gentle. James shook his head, pushing the plate away. "I'm not hungry," he muttered. She observed him for a moment, saying nothing. She was exhausted but knew that giving in to despair wasn't an option. Emma had always been the family's pillar, but even the strongest pillars show cracks. Meanwhile, Oliver rose from the living room, carrying his backpack to the kitchen. "Dad, can you help me with math?" he asked, holding his notebook with a hopeful expression. James forced a smile. He knew his son didn't really need help. It was just his way of sparking a conversation and bringing some normalcy to the strained environment. "Of course, son," he replied, trying to push aside the heavy thoughts that weighed on his mind. That night, as everyone tried to sleep, the sound of passing cars echoed through the house. James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with financial calculations that never balanced. Across the room, Emma slept lightly, her breaths uneven, as if even in her dreams she was worried. Outside, on a bench near the Walker's house, a man wrapped in a tattered blanket observed the movement of the windows. His name was Henry Carter, and he knew the look of despair he had seen on James's face that morning as the man carried groceries. Henry was used to being invisible, but something about this family had caught his attention. At that moment, 2 stories that didn't yet know they were intertwined began to intersect, weaving a fate that would change all their lives. The community market was bustling that Saturday morning. Emma arranged the items she and James had decided to sell: an old lamp, clothes the children had outgrown, and a box full of trinkets. The atmosphere between them was tense. James, standing beside her, watched the activity around them with a distant air. Emma, focused on attracting customers, tried to maintain her composure, but the weight of their situation was evident. "Are you sure we'll get anything out of this?" James muttered, eyeing the pile of items he saw as worthless. Emma sighed, keeping her tone firm. "If we don't try, we'll never know. And anything is better than doing nothing." Meanwhile, Henry Carter wandered slowly through the market stalls, observing the people around him. He moved unnoticed as usual, which allowed him to quietly watch others' lives unfold. When he spotted James, he recognized the man he had seen days earlier, carrying bags with the lost expression of someone bearing a burden too heavy to carry alone. Henry hesitated before approaching. He knew his appearance often caused discomfort, but something pushed him toward that family. Perhaps it was the way Emma tried to mask her worry or the way James stared into the distance, searching for answers that never came. "Good morning," Henry said, his voice soft but firm enough to catch James's attention. James looked up, surprised by the approach. Emma, standing next to him, stepped back slightly, instinctively holding her husband's arm. "Do you need something?" James asked, his tone hovering between curiosity and caution. Henry gestured toward a bottle of water on their makeshift table. "If you don't mind, could I have a sip? It's hot today." Emma hesitated, but James reached for the bottle and handed it to the man. "Sure. Here you go." As he drank, Henry observed the couple. "You look like you're going through a tough time," he commented with disarming honesty. James narrowed his eyes, uncomfortable with the observation, but before he could respond, Emma intervened. "We're just trying to make the best of what we have." Henry nodded, handing the bottle back. "That's all anyone can do. But sometimes, accepting help isn't a sign of weakness, you know." The statement hung in the air, leaving James thoughtful. Before he could say anything, Henry gave a faint smile and walked away, blending into the crowd once more. The couple stood in silence for a moment, the brief interaction lingering in their minds. Emma returned to organizing the items, but something in James's expression seemed to shift. He couldn't explain it, but Henry's presence had stirred something within him, a spark of reflection he couldn't yet fully grasp. In the distance, Henry watched from afar, wondering if that small gesture would be enough to plant a seed of change. That evening, dinner was quieter than usual at the Walker house. Emma set out what little they had left, 2 slices of bread and a can of beans. While Oliver and Lily ate, James barely touched his food, still reflecting on his interaction with Henry. Something about the man's words unsettled him, as though a mirror had been placed before him, reflecting not only his frustration but also a deeper challenge, a call to act. The next morning, as Emma worked on sewing a dress for a client, Oliver and Lily were in the backyard trying to build a makeshift wooden castle from scraps they had found around the house. They laughed together, the tension that had recently hung over them now seeming to lift. James, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watched his children, lost in thought. He didn't notice Henry approaching until the man's voice broke the stillness. "Lost in thought again, huh?" James turned and saw Henry sitting calmly on a nearby bench, the same tattered blanket now slung over his shoulder in a worn sack. For reasons he couldn't explain, instead of avoiding the man, James felt compelled to approach. "Just trying to find a way out," James admitted as he joined Henry on the bench. Henry nodded, as though he understood perfectly. "Sometimes, the way out isn't where you're looking. Sometimes, it's closer than you think." James fell silent for a moment, staring at the ground. Finally, he let out a deep breath. "You seem to know a lot about that. I've been to places you can't even imagine, friend. Places where it feels like there's nothing left. But sometimes, even a little help can change everything." Henry looked at him with a faint smile, but his eyes held a seriousness James couldn't ignore. Before James could ask more, Henry changed the subject. "I've heard about a community pantry nearby. They distribute food and supplies. Why not take your family there?" James hesitated. His pride remained a difficult barrier to overcome. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. But when he thought about Oliver and Lily's faces, he realized it might be time to put his family's needs above his reservations. "And what about you? Why don't you go there?" James asked, deflecting the focus. Henry shrugged. "I know where to find what I need. But your family, they need this now." Henry's unexpected generosity stirred James even more. He nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." The next day, James shared the idea of the community pantry with Emma. At first, she was hesitant too, but the reality of their empty pantry made the decision inevitable. They gathered the children and headed to the address Henry had provided. When they arrived, they were greeted by kind volunteers who treated them with dignity and respect. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of relief, as though a small weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They returned home with bags of food, hygiene items, and even clothes for the children. That night, dinner was more cheerful. Oliver and Lily chatted excitedly, Emma cooked something more substantial, and James seemed more at ease. Yet, amidst this moment of calm, one question lingered in James's mind. Why would someone like Henry, who clearly had so little, be so willing to help? The next morning, as James left the house to continue his search for work, he saw Henry again, sitting on the same bench. This time, James didn't hesitate. "Hey, Henry. I think I owe you a thank you," he said, extending his hand. Henry shook it with a smile. "You don't owe me anything, friend. Just pay it forward when you can." Henry then revealed something James hadn't expected. He wasn't just someone who had lost everything. He was someone who had chosen to find purpose in simplicity. In that moment, James began to realize there was more to learn from Henry than he could have ever imagined. The days following the lunch with Henry brought a noticeable shift in the Walkers' household. The temporary relief provided by the supplies from the community pantry gave James and Emma room to breathe, if only for a while. Yet, the gratitude they felt toward Henry was still mixed with a sense of moral debt, especially for James, who couldn't stop thinking about Henry's words, "Pay it forward when you can." One sunny morning, as Emma worked on sewing a dress for a client, Oliver and Lily played in the backyard. They were building a wooden castle out of scrap materials they'd scavenged around the house, laughing and joking as they worked. The tension that had once hung heavily over them seemed to finally ease. James sat on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching his children with a distant, thoughtful expression. He barely noticed when Henry appeared, walking leisurely down the sidewalk, his tattered blanket now folded and tucked into a simple sack slung over his shoulder. When James spotted him, he stood, feeling an unexplainable need to give back, though he wasn't yet sure how. "Henry," James called, waving him over. "Wait a minute." Henry stopped and smiled, though his posture remained relaxed. James walked down the porch steps and approached him. "Why don't you come inside? Emma's home, and maybe you can stay for lunch." Henry hesitated, but the sincerity in James's eyes convinced him. He nodded. "If it's not a bother." Inside, Henry was welcomed warmly by Emma and the children. Lily, ever curious, wasted no time blurting out, "Are you my dad's friend?" "Something like that," Henry replied with a smile. He sat at the table as Emma served a simple plate of rice, beans, and vegetables. As they ate, Henry began sharing bits of his story. "I used to be a teacher," he began, glancing at Oliver and Lily with a glimmer of warmth in his eyes. "I loved teaching history. But life has a way of surprising you, not always in the way you expect." James listened intently. It wasn't just the content of Henry's story that intrigued him, but the calm and composed way he told it, as though the past's pain had somehow been transformed into wisdom. Henry recounted how a fire had destroyed his home and how bureaucracy and a lack of support had eventually left him on the streets. But he didn't complain. Instead, he spoke about the people he'd met, the lessons he'd learned, and the unexpected kindness he'd found even in the hardest moments. "Did you ever try starting over? Finding another job?" Emma asked cautiously. "Of course I tried," Henry replied. "But the world isn't kind to those who lose everything. So I decided to do what I could with what I had. I'm not wealthy, but I can share a piece of bread or a kind word. That has to count for something." A silence followed as Henry's words sank in. It was Oliver who broke it. "You're like a hero. You know, the kind who helps people without expecting anything in return." Henry chuckled, though his eyes glistened with emotion. "I'm no hero, kid. Just a man trying to do what's right." After lunch, Henry joined Oliver and Lily in the backyard, helping them construct their wooden castle. Inside, Emma and James had a quiet conversation. "He has so little, but he's still willing to give. We need to do something for him," Emma said softly. James nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe we can help him somehow, give him something back for all he's done." Later, as Henry prepared to leave, Emma handed him a bag filled with clothes she had sewn. "It's not much, but I hope it helps," she said with a warm smile. Henry accepted the gift, visibly moved but humble as always. "You didn't have to. Thank you. Truly." As Henry walked away down the sidewalk, James knew this was only the beginning. He felt a growing determination to do more, not just to repay Henry, but to honor the profound impact the man had had on his life. That night, as James watched his children sleeping peacefully, he felt something new: hope. For the first time in months, he believed things could change. And perhaps, helping someone like Henry was the first step toward transforming not only his own life but also the lives of those around him. The days following the lunch with Henry brought a tangible change to the Walkers' lives. Emma became more motivated, sewing late into the night with a renewed determination to support her family. James, on the other hand, seemed calmer yet deeply introspective. Henry's words still echoed in his mind: "Do what you can with what you have." One morning, over a simple breakfast, Emma broke the silence. "James, you've been talking about paying Henry back. Have you figured out what we can do?" James shook his head slowly. "Not yet. I want to do something that really makes a difference, but I need some time to figure out what that could be." Emma nodded, understanding. Before she could respond, Oliver burst into the room with Lily right behind him. "Dad, can we do something for Henry too?" the boy asked, excitement lighting up his face. James smiled faintly. "What do you have in mind?" Oliver exchanged a glance with his sister, who encouraged him with a nod. "We could make him some drawings, like a gift. Everyone likes drawings. And we can write him a note saying how cool he is," Lily chimed in, her enthusiasm infectious. The simplicity of the idea made James and Emma share a look, a subtle smile forming on both their faces. "That's a great idea," James said. "You two work on that while I think of something else." That afternoon, while Emma worked and the children prepared their drawings, James went out for a walk. Something was nagging at him, a feeling that he needed to do more than just a simple gesture of thanks. As he strolled through the streets, he passed by an auto repair shop he used to frequent before their financial troubles began. A sign taped to the door caught his eye. "Help wanted, general assistant." James hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The shop's owner, Bill Crawford, was known for his no-nonsense demeanor, but also for being fair. "James Walker," Bill greeted, raising an eyebrow. "Been a while, huh?" "Yeah, it has," James replied with a weak smile. "Need help with your car?" Bill asked. "Not exactly. I saw the sign on your door and thought of someone who might fit the job," James said, his voice steady with an unexpected confidence. Bill folded his arms, intrigued. "You're not looking for work?" "I am, but this isn't about me. It's about someone I've recently met. He's hardworking, smart, and just needs a chance," James explained. Bill studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Bring him by. If he's as good as you say, I'll give him a shot." As James left the shop, he felt a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. He knew Henry might resist the idea, but he also believed this could be the opportunity Henry needed to rebuild his life. The next morning, James headed to the park where he knew Henry would be. Sure enough, there he was, sitting on the same bench as always, watching the world go by. James approached and sat beside him. "Henry, I've got an idea," James began, cutting straight to the point. Henry looked at him, curious. "What's on your mind?" "I know a guy who owns an auto shop. He's hiring, and I told him you'd be perfect for the job. He wants to meet you," James said. Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on James. "James, I appreciate it, but the life I have now is simple. It's not easy to change after so long." James took a deep breath. "I understand, but think about it. You've got skills, experience. This could be your chance to do something for yourself." Henry sighed. He wasn't used to being the focus of so much attention. "All right, I'll go." 2 days later, Henry met with Bill at the shop. The conversation was brief, but Henry's sincerity and willingness to work left an impression. Bill offered him a trial period, and Henry, though hesitant, agreed with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. That same day, after returning to the park, Henry was greeted by James, Emma, and the children. Lily handed him an envelope filled with their drawings and a note. "This is for you," she said with a bright smile. Henry opened the envelope and quietly looked through the drawings. One depicted him surrounded by hearts and words like kindness and hero. He read the note aloud. "Thank you for teaching us that what matters most is what's in the heart." Henry quickly wiped his eyes, trying to hide the emotion that overwhelmed him. "I don't know what to say." You've done more for me than you realize." That night, as Henry prepared for his first day at the shop, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a renewed sense of purpose. The sun rose timidly over the city, casting a soft light across the streets as Henry made his way to the auto shop for his first day of work. He felt a mixture of nerves and hope, emotions he hadn't experienced in a long time. The tattered blanket that had always accompanied him was left behind, replaced by a clean shirt and simple pants, a gift from Emma and James. When he entered the shop, Bill Crawford greeted him with a firm nod, directing him to where he would begin. In the early hours, Henry watched carefully, absorbing the tasks he was assigned. Though it had been years since he'd held a formal job, his focus and dedication were apparent. He worked steadily and efficiently, earning quiet praise from Bill, a small boost to Henry's confidence. While Henry faced his new beginning, the Walkers were also navigating changes in their lives. Inspired by Henry's example, Emma decided to expand her sewing work, offering services to a local store. James, determined to continue lifting his family out of hardship, found temporary jobs and slowly began chipping away at the debts that had once seemed insurmountable. The most profound impact, however, was seen in Oliver and Lily. Motivated by Henry's kindness, the children began talking about compassion and how small acts could transform lives. At school, Oliver organized a food drive to help families in need, filling his parents with pride. One evening, Henry stopped by the Walkers' house after work, carrying a bag of fresh bread and fruit. He knocked on the door and was greeted by Emma, who was surprised to see him. "You didn't have to bring anything, Henry," she said warmly. "I had to," Henry replied simply. "You've given me so much. It's my turn to do something for you." That night, as they shared a meal together, Henry spoke about how the job was beginning to change his life. "I never thought such a simple opportunity could mean so much," he said. "And it's all because you believed in me." James, listening intently, replied with sincerity. "The truth is, you've taught us more than anyone else could. You've shown us that sometimes, the little we have is enough to make a difference in someone's life." The conversation was briefly interrupted by Oliver, who brought out a notebook filled with ideas for helping people experiencing homelessness. "What do you think, Henry? I want people to know that everyone deserves a chance." Henry smiled, his voice filled with emotion. "I think you're already doing more than most adults, kid. Keep it up." As Henry left the Walkers' home that night, he carried with him not only their gratitude but also the knowledge that the kindness he had shared was continuing to ripple outward, inspiring acts of compassion and hope where despair had once taken root. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to show your support. Like the video, leave a comment sharing what moved you the most, and share it with someone who needs a message of hope today. Your interaction makes all the difference in helping us share more stories like this. Together, we can inspire even more people to look beyond appearances.